Show me the crypto. Show me the crypto. Show me the crypto.
In a world on the brink of disruption, two men will bring you clarity by interviewing some of the most intelligent and influential names in the blockchain world. Welcome to Show Me the Crypto with your hosts, Wade Patterson and Ulf Lonergan.
Well, hi there and welcome to Show Me the Crypto. My name's Wade Patterson.
And I'm Ulf Lonergan.
We're a couple of friends from Canada who love learning about cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, and we're happy you're along for the ride. Whether you're a crypto virgin or you know your way around the block, we hope our interviews with some of the most intelligent and influential people in the blockchain space help bring you value. And on this episode, we're joined by Jon, co-founder and chief product officer at ShapeShift. When Jon read Satoshi's whitepaper back in 2011, he scoffed at it. A year later, Bitcoin caught Jon's attention after surging from approximately $1 to $30. The second glance proved to be life-changing as Jon fell down the proverbial rabbit hole and has been full-time in the space since 2013. In 2014, Jon co-founded ShapeShift along with Erik Voorhees, and he is currently the chief product officer. One of Jon's core beliefs is that innovation happens when you build for where things are going to be, not where they currently are. Jon, welcome to Show Me the Crypto.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was a great intro. You guys clearly did some research into some things I've said in the past.
Well, we're excited to have you on, and I want to dig a little bit more into that because I'm sure I just hit the wave tops in the intro there. But what was that initial reaction to crypto? How did you initially get involved in the space?
Yeah, so great question. So yeah, that intro reminded me, and I haven't thought about some of those things in a while. But yeah, the first time I remember hearing about Satoshi's white paper in some tech news feed or something I was reading at the time. And I like read it. I thought that was interesting. And then I immediately thought to myself, well, that's stupid. That will never work. Because I just didn't understand the fundamentals of the tech yet. And like, you know, as many of us think about, you know, through the kind of Napster age and everything about file sharing and just how easy it is to copy and transfer digital information. My initial thought was like, how could you ever do that with money? But I clearly had very little understanding of the cryptographic underpinnings of Bitcoin at that time. I did not fully understand what I was reading. And so I kind of dismissed it. And I know a lot of really smart people in the space did the same thing when they first read about Bitcoin. But then, when I kind of saw and read about that bull run up from, you know, $1 up to the like $30 range, that really piqued my interest again. I was like, why are people paying money for this? I just don't understand. And then that caused me to really read about it, you know, learn about things like the Byzantine generals problem and this trust problem that Bitcoin was solving and how it was solving the double spend problem. And then it just, you know, it kind of bit me, and I was, you know, I had the bug and I just couldn't get it out of my head. And I just kept reading more and more and trying to find ways to disprove it, find ways this thing wouldn't work or why it wouldn't work. I had all this extreme skepticism. And the more I dug into it, the more I just found good answers. So I was like, wow, there's a really interesting problem being solved here. And I just didn't get that at first. And so that, yeah, kind of, as you said, that led me to me falling down the rabbit hole. And then, you know, the more and more I tried to disprove it, the more and more it was clear to me that this thing actually had a real chance of working, that there was a real fundamental kind of step function increase here in what had been created in regards to digital value. And that just, you know, led to everything else. But that was definitely the beginning of it.
Erik Voorhees, CEO of ShapeShift, you know, he's one of the well-known OGs, and you yourself are as well. When did you meet Erik, and what was your initial impression of him at the time?
Yeah, so I was actually, as I kind of fell down that rabbit hole, I was running a kind of web and mobile application development company that I had co-founded with a few other people at the time. And we were really just kind of working on kind of general web and mobile applications. And this was back, you know, when the iPhone was still a relatively new thing. So mobile apps were like the big thing. And, you know, I kind of saw that that's where the money was, and I wanted to pour resources into building for that. And when that happened, when I fell down that rabbit hole, really got a glimpse of Satoshi's white paper, really understood what Bitcoin could be. I kept started telling my partners, like, hey, we should really get into this thing. Like, we should be working in this thing. Like, I think this thing's going to be big. And at the very least, we should start taking Bitcoin as payment. Like, things like BitPay already exist. There was already ways to hedge that risk, even if you didn't want to take the volatility risk on your company. And I was like, at the very least, we should be, taking Bitcoin as payment, and we'll see what happens. And all my partners thought I was crazy. I was very much the proverbial, crazy Bitcoin guy in the office for quite a while. And like, everyone got really sick of me talking about Bitcoin all the time, but they at least listened enough. They were like, okay, we can do this. You got this BitPay thing. Let's slap a Bitcoin accepted logo on our website. And we did that. And probably about, 3 to 6 months later, I don't remember the exact timeline, after we did that, we got a reach out from this guy. I think he called himself Robert or something like this at the time. He was using a pseudonym, and he was like, hey, I'm looking for, someone to do some work on some projects that I'm looking at doing, and I want to pay in Bitcoin. And I saw you guys accepted Bitcoin on your website. So I'm reaching out to like get a sense of you. And we started going back and forth with this guy. And then he liked what we were talking about, and he liked the kind of services we were offering and the kind of design we were able to offer and things like that. And then he kind of revealed himself as we were signing our first contract. He's like, actually, my name, it's not Robert, it's Erik Voorhees. And I didn't really even know who Erik was at that point, to be honest. I wasn't deep enough into the ecosystem yet that I even knew who Erik Voorhees was. And he was already relatively well known in the space. He had already sold Satoshi dice, all these things. So I think after we got off that call, I Googled him and, found what actually was probably not very accurate information, because like the stuff on his Wikipedia, even today, I don't think is super accurate. But I learned a little bit about him. I was like, okay, so this guy kind of, has been in the space a little bit and, is kind of well known. This is interesting. And then we started working with him. So basically that was how I met him. And I like to say, such a small action, putting that Bitcoin accepted logo on our website, which was literally, took us 2 seconds to put up this photo, this little image on the website, has basically had this gigantic consequence on the last decade of my life. And you don't think about how such little actions you're going to take can do that. And basically that project that he brought actually had nothing to do with ShapeShift. It was something totally different. We worked on it with him for about 6 months. And then he brought us another thing. He's like, actually, and I've got this other little side project idea. I think it's, I really want to be able to basically just send one digital asset and get another one, because Erik had experienced this problem of, he was trying to experiment with some early altcoin, and there really weren't many at that time. It's like Litecoin, Namecoin. There weren't very many Purecoin. And he just experienced all the frustration of trying to go through one of these centralized exchanges and setting up his account and depositing his funds and making his trade. And he's like, why can't I just send one thing and get another? Why is this so hard? This is all digital. There's no reason for this to be so hard. And that it turned out to be the idea for ShapeShift. And what he thought would be this small side project turned into, subsuming the other project. The other project got put by the wayside, and ShapeShift kind of took off. And then the rest kind of became history. And that is what we ended up doing. So yeah, that was how I met him, and everything from them. And that I kind of put it all back to that, putting Bitcoin accepted on the website and everything we were doing. And ever since then, that's been my life.
It's so crazy, like you said, to, how sometimes one simple action just can change the complete trajectory of your life and your path and everything along those lines. One of the questions I want to ask, because I think one of the things that's thought about when you think about Erik Voorhees is that he's very strong into Bitcoin, like maybe Bitcoin maximalist. So what was it like remaining asset agnostic as you were starting up ShapeShift, considering, the strong beliefs about Bitcoin specifically?
Yeah. So when we started ShapeShift, Bitcoin, Erik was still very much a Bitcoin maximalist. He didn't necessarily, he thought these other tech, might be interesting, but he didn't necessarily believe in any of that yet. And so he kind of started having this inkling that, like, hey, in a world where all these things are digital and there's all these various interesting digital assets, it's unlikely that there will be only one digital asset. And I think that was kind of always the thesis of ShapeShift, is like, we don't know what the important digital assets will be, but we were pretty confident there will be more than one. Like, there will be more than one, probably hundreds, probably thousands. We don't know what those assets will be. And we weren't trying to take bets on what those important digital assets would be. But we did want to basically build a system that would make it very easy to go from one digital asset to another, because we thought that would be a super important piece of infrastructure, basically. It would be super important for someone to be able to just send one, get another, and do it in a very digitally native way, without all the trappings of the old financial system, without worrying about fiat currency, without worrying about the banking system, and all these things that basically all the pain points that every Bitcoin exchange had dealt with to that point had nothing to do with Bitcoin. It had to do with everything else. Tapping into the banking system, ACHs, at the time it was like Dawala, like well before you had better ways to on-ramp your fiat. And so I think over time, and especially I think post-Ethereum, Erik's really started to change his mind, and he really started to basically realize that maximalism didn't make sense from his perspective. I think him and I both still believe to this day that Bitcoin is the most important asset in the ecosystem, and likely the long-term store of value, of the world, basically, but certainly the crypto ecosystem. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other digital assets with different attributes that still have value. Like maybe there's only going to be one sound money long-term, but there's all sorts of other types of assets that will exist in a digitally native fashion. And those will be important to be able to go from one to the other. That's really how, I think we viewed it together. I certainly viewed it. And I think that's how Erik's thinking changed over time, where he went from being pretty much a hardcore maximalist to realizing, but there's going to be other assets, and they don't have to be money to be useful.
And stepping back a little bit into, when Erik kind of pitched this idea and you were conceptualizing ShapeShift, I mean, I'm sure, there's been many changes from where it started to where it is today. But what was that initial, you kind of just went into a little bit, but what was that initial vision for ShapeShift, and how has that maybe changed over the years?
Yeah, great question. So, a lot of ShapeShift, and even slightly before, but really when we started working on it in earnest, it was slightly after, the Mt. Gox fiasco. So, early on in Bitcoin, Mt. Gox was the only Bitcoin exchange. There really was nothing else. You had things popping up, like one of Erik's former companies that he worked at, BitInstant, that basically worked off of the rails of Mt. Gox to find different ways to get people Bitcoin in faster, quicker factions. And BitInstant was like, it wasn't even truly instant. But it did have the ability to get you Bitcoin quicker than you could by waiting, your 5 days to get your money onto Mt. Gox and then getting it on there and doing your trade and trying to pull it off. But then we had this whole fiasco where the whole thing collapsed. And, I'm not going to try to recount all of that here, but effectively, it really brought home the nature of the problem of custodianship. That, like, ultimately, if we have Bitcoin and we're trying to get away from the shackles of traditional finance, there was this huge problem of if you're basically putting your Bitcoin with someone else, if you don't control the keys, you're going to have this problem long term where, like, something can happen and they can basically run away with your keys, or they can collapse, or the malfeasance, or any of these things that can happen. And ShapeShift was very much a reaction to that. Like, how do we let people trade from one digital asset to another and do that in a manner in which that can't happen, where a user always had control of their own keys, of their own funds, and they could not lose their funds in this, like, centralized way. And that's what ShapeShift was built around. Like, we always wanted to be non-custodial. We never wanted to hold user funds. We wanted them to only have to trust us for the briefest fraction of a second that we could, basically just enough time for, like a vending machine, for you to put your dollar in and for, your item or your digital asset to pop out the other side. That was really the ethos of everything we've built. And really, even to this day, that ethos has not changed. And then there was also, of course, the ethos of, we also did not want to necessarily have an account. We did not want to necessarily have anything that you had to sign up with. if it wasn't necessary. We didn't want to take any information from the user that was not necessary for the transaction itself. And so all these things kind of coalesced. That ethos is still very much built into ShapeShift. Over time, we've kind of evolved from being obviously more than just an exchange to the point today where we're kind of a full-featured non-custodial platform, we like to call it, where you can basically store your crypto with us. I mean, not with us, but yourself, but we empower you to hold your own keys and to do this. And going from there, then we want to basically enable all this kind of cross-chain activity and integrate with everything that's happening in decentralized finance. So where ShapeShift started as a very simple application, put in one digital asset, get another one out. Today, we're kind of more about building the gateway for non-custodial crypto. That non-custodial part is very much part of our ethos, and built that gateway to allow anyone to interact with any blockchain application or any blockchain activity they want to do without having to give up custody, without having to give up control of their keys. That's really where we are today, and what we still find to be the most important part of our mission, because so much of what's developed, the Coinbases of the world and things like that, which we think is super important to the ecosystem. I'm not trying to say anything negative about them. But we do have this belief that if all we do in crypto is basically develop a bunch of custodial solutions again, that we will have just basically invented banking 2.0 and that nothing will have actually been accomplished. So for us, that mission is to really make non-custodial UX as easy as possible and to really empower users to do that in such a way that they don't have to feel like they need to store their keys with somebody else.
Yeah, some really good points there. And Jon, we're kind of, or what feels like in the potentially the early start of a bull run or partway through a bull run, and what those tend to bring, because people are drawn to the space based on prices and that kind of exciting information. And so there's probably a lot of new people coming into the space, and that's the whole reason for this show, is to help educate those who are new. And I'm wondering if you can take that a little bit further of just helping to explain to those who are new to crypto maybe the risks that they take when they have their funds on a centralized exchange, because, while a lot, like you said, I'm sure are trustworthy and have done, all their due diligence and all that kind of thing. Even here in Canada, we had one called Quadriga CX that essentially folded and was seen to be a Ponzi scheme in some way. So can you add some insight on that?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, this has kind of been the history of the crypto ecosystem. Of a lot of these exchanges, no matter how much people trust them, have kind of gotten knocked over in one form or another, whether it's a hack or just pure negligence or whatever it was. And a lot of people have lost money that way. Basically, so the ethos comes down to ultimately that if you don't hold the keys and someone else does, it's not your coins. It's not your crypto. That's kind of the saying, and it really does ring true. Of you can't trust anyone to hold your assets for you. It's totally against the crypto ethos long term. So if something like any of these custodial exchanges, whether it's Coinbase, whether it's Quadriga, whether it's any of these exchanges, ultimately what you're trusting is that they actually have your funds. You don't own Bitcoin when you put Bitcoin on a crypto exchange. You have effectively an IOU in that crypto exchange's database that lets you trade among it. And you only own the crypto at the time that you withdraw it to your own wallet. And you're basically hoping that at the time I decide to withdraw my Bitcoin or whatever crypto I'm trying to withdraw, that it will actually happen. And most of the time, with most of the reputable centralized exchanges, it's going to. I'm not aware that Coinbase has ever been unable to do this, or the Krakens, or any of these long-standing exchanges that have good security practices. But you never know really until it happens. You never know that tomorrow something's not going to happen, because ultimately you're not the holder of the keys; they are. And the other thing is that this causes centralized counterparty risk, in that the more these centralized exchanges coalesce in all these various Bitcoin, all this various crypto into one place, it also becomes a honeypot. So hackers looking for the best payoff for their efforts, they're going to go after the place that holds, a bunch of people's Bitcoin, rather than after every individual crypto holder. Because in order to do that, would be a lot more effort for a lot less reward. So the best reward for them is to knock over one of these exchanges, because they hold thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people's crypto. And yeah, they might have better security practices, but it's not a million times better than what you would have holding yourself. And so if they can basically put in that effort and find a way to knock that over, they're going to get a much better payout. than they would otherwise. So you're taking that risk as well. Basically, it's much more of a target. So this is really, and this is what we saw originally with Mt. Gox, and we've seen with a number of other crypto exchanges. Quadriga is another example. And it doesn't matter how good the people are necessarily, or what you think of those people that are running that thing. So like Quadriga is another great example. My colleague and Chief Information Security Officer at ShapeShift, Michael Perklin, he personally knew the CEO of Quadriga. He's another Canadian, like you guys, originally from Toronto, been in the space a long time. He knew the Quadriga CEO, Gerald Cotton, and he thought he'd hung out with him. He thought he was a great guy. He had no reason to think that he was doing anything nefarious or that he wasn't keeping things together. And then when the whole Quadriga thing, he was as flabbergasted as anyone. But he also knew all the fundamental thing of like, hey, ultimately, if you're keeping your crypto anywhere, no matter who you think is holding it, something terrible can happen because you don't hold the keys. So like, we can go a lot deeper into that subject, but that's the real basics of it, is just ultimately, if you're not holding the keys, it means someone else is and you're trusting them. And everything around crypto is built around not having to trust anyone else. When you hold your keys, there are certain risks that you take, certainly, and finding ways to secure that, making sure that you write down your seed phrase correctly, using some sort of cold storage to keep your keys offline. But these are all things that are like have gotten easy enough today that an average person can at least do a little bit of research and learn to do this, and they will be far better off, especially if they're planning to hold that crypto over the long term, than keeping it on any sort of centralized exchange.
Ulf, did you realize that our audience has either been watching or listening to this episode for more than 20 minutes?
20 minutes? No way. They should probably subscribe.
Yeah, they should subscribe and like and comment and turn on that notification bell. All right, back to the episode.
Speaking about counterparty risk and security, I watched a talk you did on Weird Stories, I think it was called, and you actually went into some of the security challenges that you dealt with at ShapeShift in the early days. And it goes back to what you were just talking about, in that you could be a fully trustworthy person and things can still go wrong. And I'm wondering if maybe, it was a bit of a long story, but maybe you can give us the Coles Notes version of some of those challenges you went through when you had, I believe it was a internal team member and there was, a bit of tomfoolery going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, what you're referring to is that in 2016, ShapeShift itself had dealt with an internal hack. And this was, for those of us dealing with it, it was still pretty early on in our life. It was before even the crypto bull run of 2017 started. So it was really an existential problem for us of like, hey, we lost this money. Are we going to survive, et cetera? Fortunately, it did kind of reinforce our model of like kind of protection by design. The only money that was ever at risk was ShapeShift's money, not any user money. So that made it a lot easier to deal with. And users obviously were never at risk as a result. But yeah, we dealt with the fact that we had a small team, and one of the team members that we effectively had entrusted to help us secure our servers, effectively a sysadmin type role, betrayed us and basically went into one of our servers and stole Bitcoin from it because he had access to this thing, and basically absconded. And we realized very quickly that this had happened. I was actually the one who originally discovered the theft, and at the time I was basically managing a lot of our operations kind of directly myself because we were a very small team, and realized that hey, a bunch of Bitcoin is missing from this wallet. What's going on? We immediately launched into kind of our own internal investigation of that, and within 24 hours, probably less than that, we kind of knew who it was. It was pretty clear that this was not an outside attack, that this was an internal theft. And we dealt with all the fallout of that. And basically that particular individual, even though we reported it to local authorities and federal authorities and all these things, they didn't necessarily do much about it. And so this guy was able to abscond with that Bitcoin. We weren't necessarily able to do anything to get it back. And then 3 weeks later, we suffered another attack. We basically had rebuilt all our infrastructure, but we suffered another attack and we didn't understand how. And what had actually happened in retrospect was this guy basically he had more or less put in a backdoor into one of our systems And he had then sold that to someone on the dark web, who then used that to attack us again. And so we dealt with these like succession of attacks on our systems. And it caused us to basically burn down everything we were, like all of our infrastructure, and rebuild it all again. And it was probably, the most stressful few weeks of my life, dealing with that and not knowing if this thing we had been building for 2 years was going to survive, and if our customers would ever forgive us, and all of these things. And it was just really terrible. Now, the good news is that a lot of good things came out of that. It really hardened our security measures. It really made us much more aware of these internal threats. Erik published a whole report on this that anyone can Google, called Looting of the Fox, where he basically tells this whole story about what happened and what we learned. And even at the time, it was very rare for crypto exchanges, or really anyone who suffers any sort of data breach or data hack, to really publish any real details. And we published like everything. And we actually hired through this process. We also, basically came in contact with and hired Michael Perklin, who was a independent investigator at the time, to come and help with that, who eventually would become our chief information security officer, even after seeing all of this stuff. But basically our security practices got a lot better after that. We learned a lot. We learned about various ways to architect things so that things like this could not happen, and realizing that one of the biggest threats to any crypto company was not necessarily external, although you certainly have to protect against that. It was your own employees. And that really sucks, because, you want to trust these people that you were paying to help build with you, that you were incentivizing, that and work with every day. But ultimately, all it takes is one bad actor with the right access, if the access controls are not built correctly, to do a lot of damage. And I think we're lucky that, again, we built this system by design to be resilient to this, so that we had to deal with the loss of funds that, over the course of crypto hacks is actually pretty small. And we were able to deal with that, but we didn't have the liability of a bunch of customer funds. And that really let us, move forward without that. Our customers, were never pissed at us in the way that they were like with Mt. Gox, because they didn't lose any money. And so they were willing to trust us again and to really move forward with us. And we've been able to grow, obviously, considerably since then. But yeah, it was really this big lesson in the problem of internal hacks. And the reality is, if you look through the kind of history of crypto hacks, almost every single one of these exchanges that experience something like this, there's almost always an internal element. If it's not entirely internal, there's someone internal feeding information to someone external. That's kind of the theme. It's like when you're building a crypto company that deals with any sort of security of digital assets, you need to look internal first and really secure strongly against that, because if you don't, that's always your biggest attack vector.
So, Jon, all that said, obviously that was, as you mentioned, the most stressful time in your life. I mean, most people would not want to say the most stressful time in their life was maybe a good thing. But do you think in the end that, all the stress, all the negativity, all the loss that came with that ultimately was that maybe for the best overall for ShapeShift, at least as a company? Or do you think that you guys could have done without it, and security and everything like that would have improved in the long run?
No, that's a great question. I do think it was for the best, ultimately, for a number of different reasons. So would our security have improved in the long run? Probably. We probably would have spent some time and money, but it wouldn't have improved as fast. And we never really would have learned the lesson the same way. Like, there's nothing, like all the theoretical understanding of security in the world will never replace the experience of actually dealing with something like that. It really drives it home to you and everyone involved with it about how important that stuff is and why it's important. And it causes a lot of reactions. And, over time, even after an incident like that, the farther and farther you get away from that incident, the more people you bring on to staff that did not experience that incident, they don't have that same understanding. And so some of it slips. But for us, it was super important. It really re-engineered everything about how we do things, how we build our infrastructure, how we hire people, how we interview people, how we look at understanding the risks of who has access to what. It literally led to one of our most important hires over the course of ShapeShift history in Michael Perklin, our chief information security officer, who came in and helped us deal with that at the time, and saw ShapeShift, basically at its worst. We didn't have that good enough security. We had all these problems, and then he still decided to join the company, just a little, like a year after that, and become that chief information security officer, and has been with us ever since. And so I'm not sure we would have met him or hired him in that same manner. I'm not sure we would have ever had that same understanding. And in some ways, it was actually oddly enough, from a PR side, it actually ended up being a positive from ShapeShift. I think ShapeShift is probably, again, the only crypto exchange that managed to get hacked and come out actually looking good on the other side. And it was because it highlighted that model, that protection by design, that if we don't hold your funds, even if we get compromised, we shouldn't be able to lose your funds because we never held them in the first place. So ultimately, it forced a lot of important thinking and important design and infrastructure changes on our side. And I do think that was a good thing. I never would have said that during the time. There were literally times where I woke up, after, working on something for like 18 hours straight, and I would go home from the office for like 3 or 4 hours to get a little bit of sleep. I would just wake up screaming, wake up just screaming at the top of my lungs because this thing I had just put so much of my life and energy to, I thought was going to collapse, and I wasn't sure we were going to come back from it, and to have it go down that way was never going to sit well with me. But when I look back on it and everything we went through, and the relationships that helped cement and everything we built from that, I do think it was a good thing. And I think we were also able to share a very important story with the entire industry, not just with ourselves, but with all of crypto. And that article that Erik published, that Looting of the Fox article, had a big impact on other people learning from our mistakes and hopefully constructing things in such a way that where they didn't deal with the same problems. It certainly didn't help everyone, but I think it helped. So I think it helped not just us, but the entire ecosystem, I hope.
Switching gears, Jon, one of the things that I've read is that ShapeShift grew in popularity quite a bit in the early days because it was one of the first exchanges to add ETH to it as an exchange. And what was your initial impression of ETH at the time, and how has that evolved over the years?
Yeah, good question. So when Ethereum, when we started ShapeShift, that was like, I think 2014 was the same year that Vitalik announced the idea of Ethereum. And they did their kind of initial Bitcoin crowd sale, and they were basically working on it. And there was like years and years of development on Ethereum where it was promising all these crazy things and smart contracts and being the world computer and decentralized computing and all these things. And for years and years, it was kind of like, well, where is it? When is this thing going to launch? And then when it did, we were certainly in contact with the developers, and there was so much hype around it that, at that point, there wasn't a whole lot of interesting digital assets. So, when ShapeShift first got started, we were letting people exchange between things like Litecoin and Namecoin and Peercoin and Feathercoin and Dogecoin, assets that were mostly just Bitcoin clones. They used very similar code to Bitcoin. They changed a few variables, and then they tried to experiment in a few different ways, but they weren't necessarily doing something all that interesting. And Ethereum was trying to do something very different. It was an entirely new code base. It was an entirely new paradigm in how they dealt with transactions and all this whole idea of smart contracts and having that embedded into the software. And so we were talking with the Ethereum devs, and there was just so much hype around it that we were like, hey, we should at least pay attention to this thing. This could be really big. We don't know yet. And so for months and months, I was, as I tend to be with all these new things at first, I was very skeptical. I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. There's a lot of big claims. There's so much ambition here, and I just don't know if any of this is going to work. But we wanted to make sure that you could at least trade Ethereum on ShapeShift from an early day when it launched, if possible. So we were talking, with a few other exchanges and the Ethereum developers when they first launched, and we're like, hey, let's find a way to do this. And so we worked pretty closely with them. Our developers definitely helped integrate one of the first Ethereum nodes into exchange software like ours. And we got it up so that you could trade from Ethereum to Bitcoin really easily. And then when that launched, Ethereum didn't have as much action in the first few days. It certainly had a lot of excitement, and people started trading it a bit, but it was really probably like 3 to 6 months after Ethereum's launch when people started doing things like the DAO, and people started experimenting with ERC20 contracts. And this whole idea of like, not only did Ethereum create this whole interesting digital asset itself and the ability to write smart contracts, it created the ability to very easily issue tokens or other digital assets on top of it. The whole ERC20 standard. And then when that started to explode, especially in early 2017, we were already built for that. And we kind of started to just gain in popularity along with the popularity of Ethereum and this whole token economy that it had started. And for us, this was kind of the proliferation again of that original thesis I talked about earlier of we don't know which assets are going to be important, but we think there will be more than one. And so this allowed people to experiment with those assets. And, to be, perfectly honest, most of those assets were crap and people were experimenting. They didn't necessarily have a good lot of fundamental value thought out. But again, ShapeShift has always been kind of asset agnostic in that sense that we did not want to be picking winners or losers. We wanted the market to decide what was important. And so for us, this was great. We wanted to integrate all these assets and we wanted to let people choose whatever they want and do it in a non-custodial manner and basically see what was important to them. And so we just kind of exploded with the popularity of Ethereum. And yeah, that was definitely one of the most important things we did in late 2016, early 2017 was just being early on, having that Ethereum integration into ShapeShift. And, my own view of it has evolved over time that I've been, where I was very skeptical at first. I think Ethereum has actually delivered on many of their promises. I've been very impressed with the developers working in that ecosystem. I know that they have a lot of critics and that, many of the Bitcoin maximalists don't necessarily love them for all sorts of various reasons. But I think they've been super, probably one of the most important developments in all of crypto has been Ethereum and everything that's come after that and just the experimentation that has spawned. So I'm very impressed with Ethereum. I think, the next challenge that they really need to solve is obviously the scaling problem that they've been working hard on for years. And it's still kind of up in the air about whether or not they will solve that. But at this point, I've seen enough out of the team and the community working on Ethereum, the developer mindshare that they've grown, that I certainly wouldn't bet against them solving it. I don't know when it'll happen. I don't know if it'll be, 18 months from now or 5 years, but I would bet they will provide a real solution to this problem eventually. I just, they have shown over time that they will actually deliver. It just might take longer than anybody likes.
In regards to ShapeShift's evolution, I understand that when you started, you wanted, it was part of ShapeShift's values to have users not have to create accounts, as you mentioned, right? There was a point along the way where that had to change. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or perhaps it was not necessarily accounts, but like know your customer?
Yeah. And so there were always some downsides to not having accounts. Like, you can't really give, a user transaction history. You can't give them a number of other things that they might like to see, so not having an account was an advantage in one sense, but in another sense, there were things users actually wanted from that. So we had always toyed with the idea of like maybe eventually having an optional account. But yeah, basically, our legal analysis changed in 2018, and we did implement an account system with full KYC, et cetera. And we ran that, and we're still running it today, although we did make this announcement about our DEX integration just last month in January, that we will be moving away from that as we allow people to trade not just with us directly anymore, but with decentralized exchanges directly. But effectively, yes. So for a number of years, we did do that. That was a big change to how ShapeShift operated. And it basically just came from the fact that the regulatory analysis is constantly changing in this space. The way that our lawyers analyzed that when we first started ShapeShift compared to what it was in 2018 to compared to what it was in 2021, it's just changed over time. And we're very confident in our regulatory counsel and our legal analysis, but we have to respect, basically the different ways the winds keep blowing. And they blew a different way in 2018 and then they are necessarily even today, just in terms of our legal analysis. And yeah, that did change during that time.
Was that at all for you personally something that was a difficult decision, knowing that your beliefs coming into this were probably not inclined to have it, people have to, submit KYCs and that sort of thing? Or was it something that you were open to if they felt it was best for them from, having an account and getting the benefits of, what came with that?
Yeah, my views, It was definitely a difficult decision just because it was such a large change for the company, and we spent millions and millions of dollars on legal analysis to come to some of these conclusions. But ultimately, I'm especially in my role at ShapeShift, I've always tried to take a very pragmatic view of like, ultimately, I want to offer the customer what is best for them and what they want. So for those users that actually wanted an account, I didn't necessarily have a problem doing that. There were always requests from some ShapeShift users, even if it wasn't the majority, that they did want, their transaction history. They did want to be able to see things in a different manner. They felt more comfortable with that. And that was fine for those. I did not want to force it on anybody. I don't know that any exchange wants to force KYC on anybody, but you got to follow what you think is the law and trust your regulatory counsel. So ultimately, that's how we viewed it and what we did.
One of the things that's a treat for us, Jon, about having you on is, you're someone who truly has just been around this space for so long. And earlier in the conversation, we were talking a little bit about, for those new to blockchain technology, to cryptos, that the risks associated with centralized exchanges. But just in general, do you have some words of wisdom? I mean, this is a volatile environment. There are things that happen. Just for people who are joining during this kind of euphoria stage of a bull run, what are some words of wisdom you'd give them?
Yeah, great question. And I feel like I've been answering this question a lot lately as these bull markets pick up, like the same questions resurface that we see every one of these cycles. And there's a couple good pieces of advice I would give. So one, I've kind of given throughout this interview, which is really find a way to learn and understand and hold your own keys. This is probably the best single piece of advice anyone can give of like, if you're going to buy and hold these assets for any period of time, understand how your wallet works. That can start with a basic software wallet. And something like the ShapeShift app can help you do that, or graduate up to a hardware wallet. Like ShapeShift offers the Keep Key, which is our hardware wallet, but there's other great ones out there, like the Trezor, like the Ledger, like the Cold Card. Any of those can really upgrade your security and understanding how to use those things. Investing, some hours or a few days of research into how to use those and understanding them, definitely worth it. The other thing is just in terms of the markets, my honestly best advice, and this is a little funny coming from a company that has been built off of effectively a trading service over time. I actually don't recommend to most new users that they try to trade very much. That is how most new users lose money, is they get in, they buy and sell Bitcoin or a couple other assets a few times. They make a few $1,000s because it's a bull run. And then they think they're geniuses. And then they put in 10x what, they just started playing with, and then they lose all of it because trading in this kind of volatile market can be really, really detrimental if you don't know what you're doing. Even if you know what you're doing, you can still lose your hat. So like my best advice to people is like, especially when you're getting into the space, basically start with Bitcoin. That's, if you don't understand Bitcoin, you're not going to understand anything else. Maybe move on to ETH. Those are what I consider kind of the crypto blue chips, Bitcoin and ETH. I'm very, very long on both of those. And I think they have enough history at this point that you can be confident that those are going to keep developing in value over time. Everything else is super, super speculative. I mean, Bitcoin and ETH is still super speculative, even right now, but not as speculative. Everything else is super speculative, and just like doing your own research, understanding what you're buying on a fundamental level, understanding the technology of it, and not just the marketing and hype around it. That's really what you should be buying and holding over a long period of time. And that is ultimately, I think, the best strategy. And it's what I've personally done, and what I think many who've been around in the space is like, after you kind of go through that phase of trading for a few months and kind of losing more money than you actually put in, you realize that maybe I should just buy and hold this thing. Maybe I should just make sure I accumulate more Bitcoin, accumulate more ETH, or whatever it is that you're long on, and just buy and hold over a many years long time frame. Don't look at this as like a 2 or 3 month window where you're trying to get in and get out, because then you're trading and you're probably going to get screwed, quite honestly. But if you start buying and holding over many years, I mean, at this point, if you bought and hold Bitcoin over any amount of 4 or 5 plus year time frame, you are up. And like that's actually how people make the most money and accumulate the most value in the space. It's just buy and hold, and have conviction in it, because you understand the tech. If you don't understand the tech, you're never going to have that conviction. So research, understand, hold your own keys, buy and hold, that's the best advice for anyone new getting into the space.
I think that's great advice. When you say conviction, it makes me think of my entry into crypto and many others, which will probably happen again this cycle, but buying in at the peak and you either sell for a big loss or you have that conviction and you hold on through that long bear market until you finally come out on top again. So
yeah, exactly. And if you did buy at the last peak, you're up almost over 2x at this point. But you had to have that conviction to buy and hold. And so many people, they panic at that point. They're like, oh, I'm down 50 or 60%. I got to get out of this. And that's exactly how people lose money. So yeah, totally right about that.
So you mentioned like having your own wallet, and you mentioned hardware wallets. KeepKey, that's the one that you guys have created, ShapeShift. So I don't know hardware wallets, their inner mechanics all too well, but I do use one myself. I use Ledger, and so I know how it works from that standpoint. Are there key differences between something like Ledger and KeepKey, let's say, or are they very similar in how they function?
Yeah, there are definitely differences, but for the average new user, that those differences are not going to matter a lot. So I would say on a fundamental level, they're all similar in that the whole idea of a hardware wallet is to keep your keys offline on a non-networked device where the key never touches the internet. So like the whole idea of a Ledger, of a Trezor, of a KeepKey is that when you plug it into your computer to like sign a transaction or do whatever you need to do with it, the key never leaves the device. The key basically lives on that hardware device. And all it does is sign a transaction and then broadcast it to the computer. So the computer only gets the signed transaction and never has access to the key. So it basically creates a firewall between your private key and any kind of network device. And when used properly, that's a very, very good defense, especially against remote and any sort of external attackers that might want to attack your device. Versus if you have your private key on your computer or on your mobile device and that device gets compromised or gets malware on it, a remote attacker could basically just rip that key off of it and take all your stuff. They really can't do that with the hardware wallet. So that fundamental thing is really the same across all of them. There are differences in terms of which assets they support, which interfaces you can interface with, which exchanges you can use, which decentralized applications you can use in terms of the Web3 space and all of that type of stuff. But fundamentally, they're pretty much the same. So I think Ledgers, even though we are the owner of KeepKey, I think I recommend still Ledgers and Trezors to people all the time. They're great devices. Have no problem people are using that. Basically the moment you get over a certain threshold of risk is when I think the average person should be looking at using a hardware device. So, a few $1,000s, if you're okay with that amount of risk, that's fine. I like to use the analogy of like, you would walk down the street with a certain amount of money in your wallet. Whatever you're comfortable with that. If you're comfortable walking down the street with $5,000 in your wallet, fine. Then that's fine. Totally fine to have that like on your phone or a mobile device. But when you get into ranges like $10, $20, $50,000, maybe $100,000, wherever that risk threshold is for you, where you'd be like, that's your life savings, or you would be, absolutely distraught if that money was lost. That's really where you should be thinking about putting it into cold storage and using something like a hardware device.
Makes sense.
John, I've got kind of a random question to throw your way, but this is something that a good friend of mine asked recently, and I thought it was a good question, something I've given a little bit of thought about. But he was mentioning, okay, all of these people, especially who have been in the crypto space, a lot of people are accumulating some level of wealth right now. And what about from even like an estate planning point of view or something along those lines of like, God forbid something's to happen to these people? This is a confusing space, at least at this point in time, for people who aren't involved in crypto, and they may have no idea of, how to access that wealth if that information's not shared. Is there any ideas you have from like a somewhat secure way of going about that process?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that's coming up a lot more frequently now. I think as some of these, especially early holders, have accumulated, a large portion of wealth. There's no one good answer to this. It's going to be different for different people's circumstances and what, again, their kind of thresholds of risk are and how they want to do this. Because obviously, the more people that have access to your keys or that you trust with those in any sort of fashion, the more risk you're taking, even before you pass away and are trying to pass this on to someone else. There are definitely solutions, especially involving things like multi-sig, where this can be done in a much more secure manner. Like you could create a multi-sig wallet that's like, a 2 of 4, 2 of 5, or 3 of 7, or any permutation you want, and make sure that some trusted parties hold a sufficient number of keys so that even if you no longer have access to it, someone else does, as well as making sure that the right people have access to, recovering your seed phrase or your mnemonics and things like that. In terms of like planning for it, even from like a tax perspective, ultimately, you should look into good estate lawyers. That really hasn't changed regardless with crypto of like, the government's always going to try to reach their hand in various portions, depending on where you are, whether it's the state or the federal government or whatever country you live in. So good estate lawyers are a great thing to look into. And then, really thinking through how you want to create a setup like that. So Pamela Morgan actually created a great book that anyone that's interested in this subject should look into, called Crypto Asset Inheritance. And it's actually an entire book she wrote about this subject, trying to lay out the various ways and ideas in which you might want to go about, who you might want to contact, how to set up your keys in a proper way so that you can pass it on properly. I'm by no means an expert on this, and it's probably something I myself need to spend more time on, quite honestly. It's really hard when you're building a company to focus on things like this. But it's a great question. And it's definitely something, especially if you're accumulating any sort of decent amount, that you want to make sure passes on to your next of kin and your loved ones, that you have thought that through. So I would really recommend that book by Pamela Morgan. She wrote that a number of years ago now, highly recommended. But past that, I'm no expert on this subject, unfortunately.
So, Jon, we like to end every episode of Show Me the Crypto with a 3-question segment called You Had Me at Crypto.
All right, Jon, you ready?
All right. Yeah, I'm ready.
Who's your favorite person to follow in the crypto space?
Great question. There's a ton of people. I think the one that I find most interesting and that I'm always reading their posts on Twitter with a lot of eagerness is Balaji's, former CTO of Coinbase, created 21. He was a VC at Andreessen Horowitz, not just on crypto, but just like he's super forward thinking on pretty much everything. But he has a lot of interesting counterintuitive ideas that I think don't always seem to make sense at first, but over the long term make a lot of sense. And he has a really, really cool perspective that I really like.
Interesting. What will the price of Bitcoin be 10 years from now?
Oh, man. I think 10 years from now, it would not surprise me if Bitcoin was like well over $10 million a coin.
Wow.
It needs to get to that kind of level for it to grow anywhere near it. And this is kind of on the thesis of like, if it got to the level where gold is, it would be in the range of 500 to 1,000. I mean, 500 to a million, 500,000 to $1 million approximately, just to get to near gold's market cap. But I think Bitcoin is at least 10x, if not 100x better than gold, as a store of value and as a technology. So that's kind of where I would get something like 10 million, but it's either going to be something like 10 million or the whole experiment will have failed and it'll have collapsed to near zero. But it's pretty binary in my mind.
You're going to be the 11th episode, I believe, 11th or 12th. And that is the highest answer. We had one other person say 10 million, but you said way over 10 million. So I love it.
It'll be an interesting time if and when that comes around. If maybe people will stop referring to Bitcoins and they'll just start talking in Satoshis or something, because the number of Bitcoin will be so high. Users will most of the world will no longer be able to own a Bitcoin, right? You'll be fractions of fractions. So it'll be an interesting time. I look forward to it.
Totally. It's already getting hard for a lot of people to even own one Bitcoin. Like they see that it's, $40,000+ like it is today. And they're like, man, I can't own one of those. And they have that whole unit bias effect. But I think we will get to a point where we will start talking either in like, millibits or Satoshis or some other fraction bits, where people just think about that as Bitcoin and less about the whole unit.
Yeah. Yeah. What is the most underrated coin or project in crypto?
Yeah, great question. So I've definitely been talking about this one a good amount on Twitter lately, but I personally have been super interested the last few years in Cosmos, the entire Cosmos ecosystem and the the coin related to that is Atom, although it's actually a whole network of various blockchains and ecosystems with various assets. But yeah, Atom's actually seen a huge rise over the last week and a half. And I think that's been a long time coming. I think it's just fundamentals catching up, and I think it probably has a long way to go. The whole idea of Cosmos is to basically connect blockchains together. And they have this tech called IBC, or inter-blockchain communication, that's actually releasing just this coming Thursday. It's been in development for over 2 years. It's finally releasing, and it's going to allow anyone who builds into IBC to basically connect various blockchains together, whether it's Ethereum, whether it's Bitcoin. And I think that's going to add a ton of value to the whole space. It's not really necessarily, I don't think of it as a competitor to like a Bitcoin or Ethereum. I think of it as an adjunct that is going to basically make all of these other blockchains more powerful and be able to do a lot more. So I'm personally very interested in Cosmos and the Atom ecosystem.
But for just a quick follow-up on that, so for people who don't know a lot about it, like myself, is that kind of how you would like pitch it to them, or is there anything you might add to that?
Yeah, there's a lot you can talk about it. Like Cosmos has a whole SDK that lets anybody spin up a new blockchain with application-specific logic, where you can basically build off of these open source modules and do whatever you want, and then connect it up to the rest of the ecosystem if you want to, but no requirement to. So it's like the whole idea is a bunch of sovereign blockchains that connect to each other. They each have their own security model. They each have their own ecosystem, but they can connect and transfer value and data between each other. And so very much similar to what we're seeing in the DeFi ecosystem, where you have like these kind of Lego blocks of finance being built that people build on top of each other. I think this is going to basically be that on steroids to some degree as it actually gets fully built out, because it'll not allow just like the things on Ethereum to connect to each other, but on any blockchain that you can basically use as building blocks on top of each other. And I think that will become super powerful. So yeah, kind of inter-blockchain communication or interoperability is really the space that it's trying to play in.
Jon, this has been an awesome conversation. I know we've really enjoyed it. And so just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time for being on this episode of Show Me the Crypto.
Absolutely. It was a great time. Thanks for having me, fellas.
Thank you for listening to Show Me the Crypto. Please make sure to subscribe as well as rate and review this podcast.